Dear friends, each year congregations across the country choose one Sabbath Eve around Hanukkah time specifically to celebrate their commitment to human rights. Temple Emanu-El is doing so tonight as we welcome a true human rights champion. Robert Bank is president and CEO of the American Jewish World Service, the world's leading Jewish organization working to end poverty and promote human rights in the developing world. Robert joined AJWS in 2009 as its executive vice president, both to grow and to deepen the organization's impact in advancing the rights of the world's poorest and most oppressed people, and recently succeeded the Honorable Ruth Messenger as its president. And we are delighted to welcome Ruth here with her husband Andrew tonight. As a human rights attorney, activist, and experienced organizational leader, Robert has dedicated his professional life to fighting for the rights of women, people of color, immigrants, the LGBT community, and people living with HIV/AIDS. A recipient of the Wasserstein Public Interest Fellowship from Harvard Law School, his leadership has been recognized with the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Gay Men's Health Crisis and with the Partners in Justice Award from Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps. Born in South Africa, Robert Bank's commitment to social justice was molded by his experience growing up under apartheid, witnessing its daily cruelties and understanding its roots in racism and oppression. His Jewish identity was shaped in part by the values and history of his grandparents who had fled anti-Semitism in Europe. After immigrating to the United States and studying music at Juilliard, Robert first worked as a teaching artist in New York City's most underserved schools. There, he came to understand more fully the economic and racial divides in American life. So, he earned a law degree from the City University of New York Law School and pursued a career in advocacy and organizational leadership, defending civil rights for vulnerable minorities in New York City and around the world. A fellow Great Necker, I want to welcome his parents, Sybil and Simi, who are here too. For many years, our congregation, thanks to your generosity, has proudly supported AJWS, which through philanthropy and advocacy responds to the most pressing issues of our time, from natural disasters, genocide and hunger, to the persecution of women and minorities worldwide. With Jewish values and a global reach, AJWS is making a difference in millions of lives and building a more just and equitable world. When we lit our Chanukiah last week, we celebrated the Maccabees' heroic fight for liberty and justice. In too many corners of this world, that fight is not yet won. So tonight, Robert Bank will speak on living our history, living our values, Jewish obligations in difficult times. Please join me in welcoming Robert Bank.
As a boy growing up in South Africa, raised in a very different world than this, I never dreamed that I would have the honor of speaking in such a magnificent sanctuary, whose magnificence celebrates our history and speaks to our values. And tonight, I'm in awe of much more than the architecture. This congregation carries forward the finest traditions of the American Jewish community with your commitment to justice, more than 17 decades of service, and outstanding leadership from generation to generation. Rabbi Davidson, Thank you so much for your kind words and for inviting me to take part in this Human Rights Shabbat. I don't need to tell this congregation how meaningful a presence Rabbi Joshua Davidson is. What you may not know is that his father, Rabbi Jerome Davidson, was on our founding board of directors when a small group of visionaries established HAWS more than 3 decades ago as the only Jewish organization dedicated solely to ending poverty and advancing human rights in the developing world. And I believe from Rabbi Joshua that Rabbi Jerome is here with us tonight, and I'm so grateful and look so forward to seeing you after the service. I'd like to thank so much, first, the musicians. What a beautiful, beautiful service. Thank you. And I would like to thank Rabbi Ehrlich, Rabbi Kahn, and I was so delighted to hear and discover earlier that although Cantor Glassman doesn't sound like he's from South Africa, he can put on the accent very well, as he did for me back there. Wonderful to meet you all. And I also want to say that here in the First Reformed congregation in New York City, I want to thank Rabbi Rick Jacobs, the president of the Union for Reform Judaism, for his past service on the HAWS board and our ongoing partnership. There is no better time than now, during the month of December, to rededicate ourselves to the Jewish commitment to justice and human rights for all people. December has always held deep significance for me, and here are a few reasons why. First, 70 years ago, on December 10th, the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is celebrated annually across the world with Human Rights Day, and we celebrated it just 4 days ago. In 1948, for the first time ever, the international community set a standard for fundamental human rights and freedoms to which every person on this planet is entitled. The timing of 1948 was not random. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was approved in the aftermath of the murderous machinery of the Holocaust. It was an attempt to codify the sentiment of never again into international law. The world community finally embraced human rights after witnessing the dehumanization and the destruction of European Jews during the Shoah. For me, December has another special significance as a son of South Africa. I fled my homeland rather than serve in apartheid's army, and December is when I light a candle for Nelson Mandela, who died 5 years ago in December 2013. With courage, discipline, and self-sacrifice, Nelson Mandela went from prisoner to president. He defeated one of the world's most infamous racist regimes by appealing to universal values of equal rights and by reconciling with those who had wrongly oppressed him, who at long last were willing to do right. And I look back and I draw a straight line to where I stand today. I grew up in Cape Town, one of the most beautiful physical places in the world, where the Atlantic Ocean and the Indian Ocean meet. And I'm so grateful that my wonderful South African parents, referred to by Rabbi Davidson, Simi and Sybil, are here in this congregation with us tonight. As a child, I loved nothing more than to spend most of my weekends in my grandparents' small store in a crowded marketplace in Cape Town's District 6. It was a rarity in apartheid South Africa, an ethnically diverse neighborhood. As a young boy, I came to know the Muslim shopkeepers with whom my grandparents shared their lives. but living peacefully together side by side was abhorrent to the architects of apartheid. They could not tolerate people from different backgrounds living together in harmony. So much so that during the 1970s, the racist regime demolished District 6, violently pushing 60,000 residents from their homes to a bleak and barren land outside the city. And because of this and so much more pain and persecution that I witnessed in South Africa, I resolved to dedicate my life to the cause of human rights. Of course, December also has significance for Jews all around the world. We've just celebrated our Festival of Lights, Hanukkah, which coincides with the winter solstice, the darkest time of the year. And into that darkness, we are commanded to bring forth light. Hanukkah is the essence of what it means for a people to exercise their religion free from fear and persecution. In this spirit of a common humanity that December invites, I want to bring us to the present and tell a story of a human rights victory in the face of persecution. This is a story that is universal but speaks to us as Jews who have sought to bring to justice the perpetrators of the Holocaust. This story begins in 1981 during the genocide in Guatemala in Central America, when more than 200,000 indigenous Guatemalans and their allies were killed or disappeared. In September 1981, a 21-year-old political activist, Emma Molina Teysen, was arrested, tortured, and brutally raped by the military. After 9 days of torture, Emma managed to escape. But the army, in retaliation, kidnapped her 14-year-old brother, Marco Antonio. Marco Antonio's body was never found. The military leaders who perpetrated this atrocity and countless other crimes were not brought to justice then, and it seemed would never face punishment for what they had done. But on May 23rd of this year, in 2018, 37 long years later, that all changed. Guatemala's High Court sentenced 4 former high-level military officers to decades-long prison sentences for crimes against humanity, the forced disappearance of Marco Antonio, and the illegal detention and rape of his sister, Emma. At long last, Marco Antonio's family, his mother, his sister, his aunt, can see some level of peace. And this case gives Guatemala citizens confidence that justice rather than impunity can prevail. The brave survivors of the Guatemalan dictatorship and the Mayan genocide are writing a new chapter in the history of human rights in a nation still struggling to turn the pages from dictators and death squads to democracy. I can assure you that this victory in Guatemala would not have happened without the help of human rights activists, particularly grassroots activists. Working together at the local, regional, and national levels, these human rights activists were able to transform heartbreak into hope. This is a story that highlights just how long it can take, and we know that as Jews, how long it can take to turn suffering into simple justice. And it also explains why it is so critically important to support human rights activists for the long haul, because with hard work and persistence, victory will come. I speak to you tonight about living our history, living our values, Jewish obligations in difficult times. And the story of Marco Antonio's life cut brutally short is on my mind tonight, as are similar stories from Burma, Mexico, Uganda, India, Kenya, and other developing countries where American Jewish World Service works. And how can these stories not be front and center in my thoughts given what's going on today? As we all know, the world is horribly broken. We are facing the most severe humanitarian crisis since World War II in Africa. More than 20 million people are at risk of famine and starvation. Across the world, more than 68 million people have been forcibly driven from their homes. More than half of humanity, women, still cannot count on basic human rights or safety from harm. Every minute, 23 young girls, way too young to be married, join the 12 million a year who become child brides. As glaciers melt, the oceans rise, and extreme weather becomes the norm. More than 1.3 billion people live on land no longer fertile enough to grow food. And defenders of human rights know what this climate crisis means, because it will lead to more persecution and more lives lost. Last year alone, my friends, nearly 4 environmental activists a week were murdered in Africa, Asia, and Central and South America. Why, we ask, why were 4 environmental activists murdered merely for defending their land, rivers, and forests from threats like toxic mining and poisons from huge industrialization? Yes, these are daunting facts, but we cannot let them paralyze us. Brian Stevenson, who led the effort to build the lynching memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, says, "Hopelessness is the enemy of justice." I couldn't agree with him more. Isn't our core business as Jews pursuing justice? Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice you shall pursue. These words from Deuteronomy serve as the eternal religious obligation of Judaism. Tonight, we observe Human Rights Shabbat in this glorious and splendid sanctuary. But in this broken world, the human rights of Jews and other minorities are more threatened than at any time in recent memory. Less than 2 months ago, 11 worshippers were murdered and 7 others were injured at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. And we've witnessed other brutal attacks in churches and mosques. For these past 2 months, I know that many of us have been in conversations around kitchen tables, dinner tables, at work, and among friends about growing anti-Semitism in the United States and our own safety. Some of us may have even been nervous this evening when we entered this house of worship, fearing an attack. Without a doubt, the way we think and feel has changed. When I think about how ordinary people respond in extraordinary times to extraordinary moral challenges, I think about a very wise woman named Eva Fogelman, who was born in Germany after World War II in a displaced persons camp. Eva is a co-founder of the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous, which to this day supports the courageous non-Jews who saved Jews during the Holocaust. You know, the most common question people ask Eva is, if I had been living during the Holocaust and if I wasn't Jewish, would I have had the courage to hide someone Jewish, knowing that it would have put my life and the lives of my family members at risk of death? Eva always responds with an even more profound question. The lesson from that time is not to ask what you would have done then, but to ask yourself, what are you doing now for those who are most at risk of death today? Yes, of course, we must look out for our own Jewish community. But our history of oppression is a clarion call. It requires us to stand up for others. Caring for the stranger is embedded in the very fabric of Jewish law. The Torah mentions this mandate no less than 36 different times. So my message tonight, my friends, is not about hopelessness. My message tonight is about hopefulness, because as Jews, not only are we obligated to act, but we have the knowledge, we have the capacity, and we have the power to do so. What is our Jewish obligation when women and girls are being brutally and systematically raped by the Burmese military, driving 700,000 Rohingya people to flee from their homes to another country? What is our Jewish obligation when the environmental activist Berta Cáceres is murdered in Honduras because she challenged the building of a mega dam that threatened the very survival of her indigenous people? What is our Jewish obligation when governments in 72 countries, more than a third of the countries in the world, can execute or imprison people just because they love someone of the same gender? Our history and our heritage give us the answer. They call upon us to take action. The late Elie Wiesel, a founding board member of AJWS, was insistent that Jews must see themselves as part of the larger human family. This is why he helped create AJWS as a platform for American Jews as Jews to support the most vulnerable, no matter who they are. Accepting his Nobel Prize, also in December, it turns out, in December 1986, Elie Wiesel said, "Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." Acting upon this obligation, American Jewish World Service responds to some of the gravest global crises of our time in 19 countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We believe that the Jewish obligation is not only to help, but to help in a Jewish way, which is to adhere to the Jewish value of listening, of Shema, as in our primal prayer that we all sang tonight, Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel. And I want to share what I believe this listening looks like in action. Take India, where women from every faith community have been held back by social practices such as child marriage, discrimination, sexual abuse, and poverty. We have identified and worked with local women's organizations to reduce abuse and increase opportunities for girls and women in India. We listen to local people, people at the grassroots who actually have the answers to their own problems. We don't tell them what to do. Instead, we help them to do what they believe is right. And we put grassroots movements together with each other, locally, nationally, and globally. When they work together, there is no doubt in my mind that they change the world. The work is long and hard, but the victories are welcome. In August last year, India's Supreme Court struck down the practice that had allowed Muslim men to divorce their wives simply by saying or texting the word divorce 3 times. This was a great victory for the Muslim women's rights activists in India. And this victory won human rights for 90 million women in India. In September of this year, just a few months ago, the tireless activism of our grantee partners resulted in India's Supreme Court unanimously striking down a colonial-era law that criminalized consensual gay sex. This victory won human rights for over 100 million people. We are also working with more than 120,000 girls who are learning to stop child marriage and to demand the same opportunities to education and economic self-sufficiency as their brothers. I've mentioned a lot of big numbers. Yes, investment in grassroots organizations can lead to impressive, large-scale impact. Some like to call it scalable impact. But as I approach the end of my talk, I want to share with you one woman's story in India, because it's important for us to remember where universal human rights actually begin. As a teenager, Kushi Prajapati from New Delhi faced a future like the generations of women before her, an arranged marriage and a lifetime of poverty. But through an organization that many of you here tonight help us to support, the Azad Foundation's Women on Wheels program, Kushi learned to become a taxi driver, typically a job done in New Delhi by men. Now, Kushi supports her parents and siblings. She has earned the bargaining power to decide about marriage on her own terms. And recently, Kushi achieved a dream that Indians share with Americans. Kushi bought her family a home of their own. We've all heard the saying from the Talmud that when you save a life, it is as if you have saved the world. Together we can support women and men like Kushi Prajapati and enable them to achieve their dreams. The late American Jewish activist Leonard Fine often said, "The world is not working the way it was supposed to, it is badly broken." But to be a Jew is to know fundamentally that you are implicated in the world's repair. We are all inheritors of both the Jewish legal tradition and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We know that poverty won't disappear without action, and rights don't enforce themselves. Rather, each and every one of us has the obligation to make the world a just place, and together we have the capacity to build that world. Another rabbi in our great city, my friend, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, advises us, be the reason people believe in the goodness of people. My friends, let's commit tonight on this special Shabbat to be the reason people believe in the goodness of people. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.